There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a conference room when someone realizes they've made a decision they can't take back, and I've replayed that silence in my head more times than I can count. The moment my brother Adam looked across that table at the folder I'd just opened and understood, all at once, that the business he thought he'd just taken from me had never actually been his to take in the first place. I want to start at the beginning, because this isn't really a story about a single dramatic meeting. It's a story about 14 years of building something with my hands and my time and my own money, and about how easily people can convince themselves that history doesn't matter as much as whoever happens to be holding the loudest voice in the room on any given day. Our father Raymond started the business, a mid-sized commercial landscaping and property maintenance company, back when I was still in elementary school. I grew up around it in the literal sense, spending summers riding along in the company trucks, learning the names of every piece of equipment before I learned much else about the working world. My brother Adam, 4 years older than me, showed some early interest too, though his was always more theoretical, more about the idea of one day running something than about the actual grinding, dirt under your fingernails work of building it. I joined the company officially at 22, right out of a 2-year program in business administration, starting in the least glamorous role available, managing scheduling and basic administrative tasks, learning the operational side of the business from the ground up, in a way my father insisted on for anyone who wanted to eventually take on real responsibility, family or not. Adam, by contrast, had gone away to a 4-year university, studied something adjacent to finance, and after graduating, spent several years bouncing between jobs in other industries entirely, always with some plan that never quite materialized into a sustained career, before eventually deciding, around his late 20s, that he wanted to come work for our father too. By the time Adam joined the company, 5 years after I had, I was already running significant parts of the operational side, managing client accounts, overseeing crew scheduling across what had grown into a genuinely substantial regional operation. Adam came in at a level roughly equivalent to where I'd started, but within a year, our father had already begun grooming him for something closer to a leadership position, a decision I understood, at the time, as simply reflecting Adam's age and his degree, even though I quietly, privately, felt the sting of watching someone with far less operational knowledge get positioned above the level I'd spent 5 hard years earning. I want to be honest that I didn't leave, didn't quit in protest, didn't even voice my frustration particularly loudly, because I loved the business itself, genuinely, the actual work of it, the satisfaction of watching a well-run crew transform a neglected commercial property, the relationships I'd built with clients over years of reliable service. I told myself that titles and hierarchy mattered less than the actual work, and for a long time, I mostly believed that. The turning point, the moment that would eventually matter more than anyone in the room realized at the time, happened when I was 29, roughly 7 years into working full-time for the company. My father was going through a difficult stretch, a divorce from his second wife that had drained more of the company's cash reserves than any of us initially realized, and the business needed a significant infusion of capital to cover a gap in operating funds, capital my father, embarrassed and stressed, didn't want to seek from an outside bank given the company's temporarily strained financial picture. I had, by that point, saved a meaningful amount of money myself, partly from my salary, partly from a modest inheritance my mother's side of the family had left me a few years earlier. When my father came to me, somewhat sheepishly, explaining the situation and asking whether I might be willing to loan the business some capital to bridge the gap, I agreed, but not without conditions. I told him, and I remember this conversation with total clarity because it shaped everything that followed, that I wasn't willing to simply hand over that money as an informal family favor. I wanted it structured properly, as an investment, with a formal agreement specifying exactly what my contribution entitled me to in return. My father, to his credit, didn't argue. He understood, I think, that I'd watched him run the business somewhat informally for years, mixing personal and business finances in ways that occasionally created headaches, and he respected that I wanted this particular transaction handled cleanly. We drew up a formal agreement with an actual business attorney, not our usual accountant handling things casually, a genuine, binding document specifying that In exchange for the capital I was providing, I would receive a documented, permanent ownership stake in the company, 15% of total company shares, along with specific voting rights attached to any major structural decisions, including any future sale, merger, or restructuring of ownership. I signed that agreement, my father signed it, our attorney witnessed and notarized it, and copies were filed both with the company's official records and with my own personal documents, which I kept, along with a growing collection of other important papers, in a fireproof lockbox in my apartment, a habit I'd developed years earlier that would end up mattering more than I could have possibly anticipated at the time. For the following several years, that 15% ownership stake existed mostly as a quiet, background fact of my professional life, rarely discussed, rarely relevant to the day-to-day operations I continued managing. The business recovered from its financial strain, grew steadily, and by the time I was 35, had become genuinely substantial, employing over 60 people across multiple regional offices. Adam, meanwhile, had gradually risen to a position our father increasingly described as second in command, a title that reflected, I believe, more of our father's own aging desire to see a clear succession plan take shape than any particular operational excellence on Adam's part. Though I want to be fair and acknowledge that Adam had genuinely improved over the years, developed real skills in the client-facing and business development side of things, even if his understanding of actual field operations remained, in my judgment, considerably thinner than mine. Our father passed away somewhat suddenly when I was 38, a heart attack that gave none of us any real warning or time to prepare. His death was devastating in the ordinary, expected way. Losing a parent is devastating, but it also, almost immediately, created a leadership vacuum that the family, and the business itself, had to somehow navigate without much preparation. My father's own will addressed his personal assets, his house, his savings, his life insurance, splitting those relatively evenly between Adam and me, nothing particularly controversial there. But his will was largely silent on the specific question of company leadership and ownership structure beyond his own personal shares, which, according to the same formal agreement structure we'd used years earlier for my investment, transferred according to a separate succession plan he'd apparently established with the company's attorney sometime in his later years, a plan that, in a decision that still strikes me as somewhat short-sighted on his part, gave Adam a majority controlling interest and, functionally, primary decision-making authority over daily company operations, while my own 15% stake, established years earlier through my own capital investment, remained legally intact but suddenly positioned as a distinctly minority interest relative to Adam's newly consolidated control. I want to be honest that in the immediate aftermath of our father's death, none of this felt like an urgent problem. Adam and I were both grieving, both trying to figure out how to keep the business running smoothly during an obviously difficult transition, and for the first several months, we worked together reasonably well, dividing responsibilities in ways that mostly mirrored how things had already been functioning before our father's passing. The trouble began gradually, around 8 months after our father's death, as Adam settled more fully into his newly consolidated authority and began, I think, to genuinely believe that authority reflected some kind of clear, deserved hierarchy rather than simply an accident of how our father had structured his own succession planning. Small decisions started happening without my input that previously would have involved genuine consultation, staffing changes, client account reassignments, budget allocations for equipment I'd been managing for over a decade. When I raised concerns, Adam's responses grew increasingly dismissive, framed always in terms of efficiency and decisive leadership, language that, I noticed, conveniently justified exactly the kind of unilateral control he seemed to be consolidating. The actual break came about 14 months after our father's death, during a period when Adam had begun exploring a potential partnership with a larger regional company, a deal that would have involved significant restructuring of our own company's ownership and operational independence. I learned about these discussions almost accidentally, through a conversation with a longtime client who mentioned, in passing, hearing something about changes coming to the company's structure, changes I had never been formally consulted about, despite my documented ownership stake. When I confronted Adam directly about this, In a conversation that started calm and deteriorated quickly, he responded with something that has stayed with me clearly ever since. "Look," he said, with the particular tone of someone who has convinced himself he's being reasonable even while saying something deeply unreasonable. "I appreciate everything you've done for the company over the years, genuinely, but Dad clearly wanted me running the strategic direction here. That's just how things have shaken out. I think it's time we formalize things a bit more clearly. Honestly, maybe restructure your role into something more operational, less involved in the bigger decisions. It's not personal, it's just what makes sense for where the business needs to go." I asked him, directly, what exactly he meant by restructure your role, and he explained, with a casualness that genuinely stunned me at the time, that as part of the potential partnership deal he was negotiating, he was planning to consolidate company ownership more cleanly under his own name, offering me, in exchange for relinquishing my existing stake, a modest cash buyout and a continued salaried position managing field operations, essentially demoting me from a documented owner to an employee, without ever once acknowledging, or perhaps even fully remembering, that my 15% ownership had never been some informal family understanding. It had been a formal, legally binding investment, documented and witnessed nearly a decade earlier. "You can't just restructure my ownership stake without my agreement," I told him, keeping my voice level despite the anger building underneath it. "I have a formal agreement, signed, notarized. It's not something Dad's will, or your own reorganization plans can simply override." Adam's expression shifted, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his face, and I realized, in that moment, that he had either forgotten entirely about the specifics of that years-old agreement, or had convinced himself, over the intervening years, that whatever formal structure once existed had been effectively superseded by our father's later succession planning and his own subsequent consolidation of authority. "I mean, that was a long time ago," he said, somewhat defensively. "Things have changed a lot since then. I don't think a decade-old handshake deal really applies to the business as it exists now." "It wasn't a handshake deal," I said. "It was a formal legal agreement, with an attorney, notarized, filed with the company's official records. I have my own copy too, if the company's copy has somehow gone missing." I want to pause here and acknowledge something important. I don't think Adam was lying, exactly, when he characterized our agreement as some vague, outdated arrangement. I genuinely believe, based on everything that happened afterward, that he had simply never taken it seriously enough, back when it was first signed, to actually understand its permanence, viewing it, I think, as some kind of temporary accommodation for a specific financial crisis rather than what it actually was, a genuine, binding transfer of real ownership. The following weeks involved several increasingly tense conversations, Adam alternating between conciliatory attempts to negotiate a reduced buyout and more openly frustrated insistence that I was being unreasonable, standing in the way of a partnership deal that, in his framing, represented the company's best path forward. I remained calm throughout, deliberately, because I understood, even in the moment, that this situation would likely require more than just family conversation to resolve, that documentation, not emotion, would ultimately determine the outcome. I contacted the same business attorney who had drafted our original agreement years earlier, a decision that turned out to be significant, since she still had complete records of the original transaction and could confirm, unambiguously, that the agreement remained fully valid and enforceable regardless of subsequent changes in company leadership or my father's own separate estate planning. She explained to me clearly what I had already suspected: my 15% ownership stake, along with the specific voting rights attached to major structural decisions like partnerships, mergers, or ownership changes, meant that Adam could not legally proceed with any restructuring plan, including the potential partnership he was pursuing, without my formal consent as a documented shareholder. The confrontation that finally resolved things happened in a conference room at our attorney's office, a meeting Adam had initially resisted, insisting we could work this out as a family without involving lawyers, a suggestion I recognized, by that point, as simply another attempt to keep the conversation in a space where his newly consolidated authority could operate without the inconvenient constraint of actual legal documentation. Adam arrived at that meeting with a confidence that, in retrospect, revealed exactly how little he'd actually internalized the seriousness of the situation. He'd brought his own attorney, a younger associate who seemed, from the opening minutes of the meeting, considerably less certain of the strength of Adam's position than Adam himself appeared to be. I opened the folder I'd brought, the same folder I'd been quietly assembling for weeks, containing the original signed agreement, the notarized documentation, correspondence records confirming the capital transfer from years earlier, and a formal legal opinion from my own attorney outlining exactly why Adam's proposed restructuring could not proceed without my explicit consent as a 15% shareholder with documented voting rights over exactly this type of decision. I watched Adam's face as he reviewed the documents, watched the specific moment his earlier confidence cracked, replaced by something closer to genuine alarm as he began, visibly, to understand that this wasn't some outdated formality he could simply dismiss or negotiate around. His own attorney, reviewing the same materials, grew visibly more cautious, occasionally leaning over to murmur something to Adam that I couldn't quite hear but could easily guess the substance of. "This is," Adam started, then stopped, clearly recalibrating his entire approach in real time. I genuinely didn't think this was still active. I thought, after Dad passed, everything just sort of transferred over based on his will. His will addressed his own shares, I said. It never touched mine, because mine were never his to include. They were mine, established through a completely separate transaction, years before he passed, that has nothing to do with his own estate planning. The remainder of that meeting unfolded very differently than Adam had clearly anticipated when he walked in. His proposed partnership deal, which would have required consolidating full ownership under his name, simply could not proceed as structured, not without either buying out my stake at genuine fair market value, which, given the company's substantial growth over the preceding decade, would have been a considerably larger sum than the modest buyout he'd initially offered, or restructuring the entire partnership proposal to formally include my ownership stake and voting rights as part of the deal itself. Adam left that meeting considerably more subdued than he'd arrived, and the weeks that followed involved a genuinely difficult renegotiation, not just of the partnership deal itself, but of the broader question of how Adam and I would actually work together going forward, given how thoroughly the earlier conflict had damaged the easy, if imbalanced, dynamic we'd maintained since our father's passing. I want to be honest that this period wasn't purely triumphant for me either, even though the legal outcome clearly favored my position. There's a particular sadness in watching a sibling relationship reveal, so starkly, how little genuine respect had actually been underneath years of surface-level family cooperation. Adam and I had worked alongside each other for over a decade by that point, and discovering, so concretely, that he'd been willing to simply write my documented ownership out of the business's future the moment it became inconvenient to his own plans, left a mark that the eventual legal resolution didn't fully heal. The final restructuring, once genuinely negotiated with my ownership properly acknowledged, ended up looking quite different from Adam's original plan. Rather than a full partnership consolidation under his sole authority, the deal that eventually proceeded, several months later, formally recognized both our ownership stakes, with specific governance provisions ensuring that major structural decisions going forward would require genuine consultation between us, not just Adam's unilateral authority, dressed up in the language of decisive leadership. Adam and I had, eventually, a genuinely honest conversation about everything that had happened, sitting in his office one evening after most of the staff had gone home, a conversation that felt, in its own way, more real than most of what had passed between us in the years since our father's death. He admitted, somewhat haltingly, that he'd convinced himself, gradually, that his position as our father's clear successor entitled him to more authority than the actual legal structure of the business supported, that he'd stopped thinking of my ownership as a real, permanent stake, and started thinking of it, unconsciously, as something more like a courtesy he could adjust whenever it became inconvenient. I think I told myself a story where being the older one, the one Dad groomed for leadership, meant I'd earned some kind of default authority that didn't need to be checked against actual paperwork, he said. That's not fair to you, and honestly, looking back at everything, it's not even fair to how Dad actually structured things when he was alive. He let you invest real money, real risk, into this business, and he agreed to real terms in exchange. I just sort of forgot that mattered, once I was the one running things day to day. I appreciated the honesty, genuinely, even though it didn't erase the difficulty of the preceding months. Our working relationship since that conversation has been different, more careful in some ways, more genuinely collaborative in others, built now on an explicit, documented understanding, rather than the vague, informal assumptions that had allowed things to drift so far off course in the first place. The business itself has continued growing in the years since, now employing over 90 people, having successfully completed a modified version of that original partnership deal, one that, this time, formally reflects both our contributions rather than erasing one of them. I still manage the operational, field-facing side of things, the work I've always found most genuinely satisfying, while Adam continues handling client development and broader strategic relationships, a division of labor that, honestly, plays to both our actual strengths far better than the informal hierarchy that had developed in the years immediately following our father's death. I still keep that fireproof lockbox, the same one that held the original signed agreement all those years, though its contents have grown considerably since then. Formal documentation, now standard practice for every major decision affecting the company, a habit that started as simple personal caution, but has become, over time, genuinely useful institutional practice for the business as a whole. I don't think of what happened as revenge against my brother, and I want to be clear about that distinction, because I think it matters. I never wanted Adam to be embarrassed or diminished in front of his own attorney, and the months following that conference room meeting were genuinely difficult for both of us, not some triumphant victory I savored. What actually happened was something quieter, and, I think, ultimately more valuable than any kind of engineered comeuppance. A piece of paper signed nearly a decade earlier, born from genuine financial risk I'd taken to help save the business during a difficult stretch, simply did exactly what it was designed to do when it finally mattered, protecting something real that years of shifting family dynamics had nearly allowed to be quietly erased. I think about that original conversation with our father often, the one where he came to me, somewhat embarrassed, asking for help, and I chose, deliberately, not to simply hand over money as an informal favor, but to insist on something documented, permanent, real. At the time, it felt almost uncomfortable, formalizing something so directly tied to family, treating my own father's request with the same careful structure I'd apply to any other business transaction. Looking back now, I understand that discomfort was exactly the instinct that eventually protected not just my own stake in something I'd spent 14 years building, but, in its own way, protected the business itself from a restructuring that would have concentrated too much authority in one person's hands without any real accountability built in. If there's a lesson in any of this, it's not really about business ownership specifically, though that's certainly part of it. It's about understanding that the people who love us, even the people who work alongside us every day for years, can still, gradually and without any particular malice, convince themselves that our documented contributions are somehow less permanent, less real, than whatever authority happens to be most convenient for them in the moment. Adam never set out, I genuinely believe, to steal something from me. He simply drifted, slowly, into a version of the business's history that conveniently minimized my role, until a signed page, kept carefully in a fireproof lockbox for nearly a decade, reminded him, undeniably, exactly how things had actually been agreed to, back before authority and convenience had a chance to quietly rewrite the story. This story is a work of fiction, inspired by the countless quiet family business disputes so many families navigate. If any part of it felt familiar to you, tell me in the comments which moment landed hardest, and stay close for the next story in this series, because sometimes the truth doesn't need to be argued for, it just needs to be found, still exactly where you left it, signed and waiting.